Disclaimer. The following book is written by Kazuhige Nojima. There is no copyright infringement intended, and this is not for monetary gain. If at any time I am told to take this down, I will comply. Part 1. See Me, Feel Me. Let's start with a little about me. When I was 14, I took in a jet black tomcat. This pitiful guy was meowing on the side of the road near my house, so I just scooped him up and took him home. I still hadn't come up with a good name when my mom started calling him Jet. Typical, naming a cat after the color of his fur. I grumbled about it, but I never did come up with anything better. Jet slept everywhere but the chairs and cushions we put down for him. Every couple of hours, we'd find him somewhere different. The dine-in kitchen, my room, my mom's room. Our house wasn't all that big, but he kept finding new nooks and crannies for his feline naps and meditations. He didn't stick around long, though. About 6 months after he arrived, he ran off. Must have thought our house was as out of good spots. I'd turned 15 by then. I don't know how old the cat was. Maybe he never liked us, I said one night, reminiscing about Jet. Oh, boys always leave home once they're grown, said my mom in the voice that she used when dispensing her brand of worldly wisdom. I'd never dreamed of leaving home or leaving Mom. I just wanted to hurry up and grow up so I could earn money and help her out. She worked at a cafe in the daytime and a bar at night, so she was always dead on her feet. And yet, she never failed to find a reason to keep me from taking any jobs I found. I'd had a weak heart as a kid, and I think she was still freaked out about it. I'd had surgery to fix it when I was 5, and it had been fine ever since. I was pretty sure I was in perfect health. Come on, Mom, I want a job, I told her. Don't you want to rest a little? You're a good son, and I appreciate the thought. But just hold on 2 more years, okay? Until you're 17. She twirled her finger in her hair. She had stunning blonde hair that reeked of cigarette smoke from work. Why do I have to be 17? Because that's how old Jet was. That made no sense at all. Getting a job didn't mean flying the coop. I thought we should have an actual conversation about it, but I hated talking to her when she was drunk. After another half a year, I spotted Jet on a street someplace. Or the spitting image of him, at least. He'd gone feral, covered with scratches and missing the tip of an ear. I called his name, and he shot me a look like I was the last creature he wanted to see. Pretty soon, he was trotting away. When I tried to chase him, he climbed up a fence and hopped onto a roof, without so much as a glance behind. I wasn't about to follow him up there. I want to get a job, I'd say. Just wait a little longer, she'd say. The conversation happened so regularly that you could set your watch by it. Most of my friends had jobs, and anyway, I figured I should at least be earning a little bit of change for myself. I felt like the butt of a joke that people just couldn't stop laughing at. In Sector 6 of the Plate, near the end of the street bustling with shops and bars and restaurants sandwiched between a bookstore and a workshop for modifying weapons, there was a dank alley that smelled of rusting steel. The alley led to a back street crammed with identical houses like something out of a kid's drawing, with the fake brick fronts and cookie-cutter designs. One of them was ours. I'd heard the neighborhood was developed back when the Plate was built to provide housing for low-level Shinra employees. But later, they moved the company housing to Sectors 5 and 7. There were plans to raise the buildings, but some fat cat who owned half the bars on the nearby streets leased them from Shinra so he could house his own staff. The rent was cheap enough, though, that the folk who come topside from the slums or the handocks could finally live the dream, even if they barely had 2 gil to rub together. It was a tenement block that stood out like a sore thumb from a well-to-do Plate neighborhood around it, but everyone agreed it was better than the slums. It was the week before I turned 17. The phone woke me and I could hear my mom talking quietly to someone. When I got up, she was scrubbing the kitchen, which was weird because I was the one who did all the cleaning around the house. See, my days were kinda empty. I'd study at my tutor's place and hang out with friends, wander around town, watch whatever I could on our TV's terrible reception. With no job, I had hardly any responsibilities, so housework was all I could do to help, and I did it well. When I told her I'd just cleaned the kitchen yesterday, she replied that a visitor was coming. I want to introduce you. Could you get dressed? She wouldn't meet my eyes. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing, and I was right. Nick Foley was in his mid-30s, about the same age as my mom. He was slim and tall, and he wore a sharp-looking gray suit and pastel pink tie with white polka dots. He was handsome, I guess, in a boring kind of way. He stood at the door, beaming at me. "I work in operations at Shinra. You can call me Nick." Everything about his manner said, "I just know we'll be great friends." And for a second there, I almost fell for it. I decided I needed to be careful around this guy. "Wow, you really do look like your father," Nick Foley remarked, then got the expression of someone who'd just said something he really shouldn't have. "You knew him?" I asked. My father had died shortly before I was born. No photos or anything. I had no idea what he looked like. No, I just meant you don't exactly take after your mother." "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I heard what happened. You're a good-looking kid, though. You must get all the girls." I must have sneered or something, because he turned to my mom for help. "Why don't we have cake?" Mom suggested. "Mr. Foley brought some from Miss Tosca." She put the plates onto the table a little too hard and served us the overly decorated slices. We had Miss Tosca's pricey mounds of cream and sugar only on special occasions, namely payday. A little treat for myself, Mom would say, and we'd take our time enjoying it. "Go on, you two, have a seat," she urged. "Fantastic. I've been wanting to try this cake ever since I first heard about it. I'm not usually one for sweets, but..." Nick Foley plopped into my usual seat like he owned it. I wish he'd dropped dead on the spot. Even Mom's smile was starting to look strained. There were 3 chairs at the table, and of the remaining 2, I took the one opposite my foe. It also happened to be my mom's, so she had to sit in the seldom-used chair for guests. Nick Foley must have noticed the chill that had settled over his welcome. He sighed and leveled his gaze on me, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. "I probably should have introduced myself to you sooner, but I couldn't find the time," he said. "Guess we're cutting it a little close. Has your mother told you about me?" Then he looked at my mom. She mumbled an almost inaudible apology for neglecting to mention it. "Well, this is awkward. We can't change our plans now, though. Everything's already set up. We're leaving Midgar in 2 days, and you need to get ready." "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "Your mother and I have been discussing it for a while, and we decided that you have to come with us. Family is family, right? So I'll get out of your hair now, and she can fill you in on..." I swiped the cake off the table, plates and all, and ran out of the house. In my head, I could still hear the dishes breaking for a while afterward. That wasn't like me, I thought. Maybe once I'd calmed down a little, I'd go back and talk to Mom. Apparently, she'd been keeping a lot from me. But damn, leaving town in 2 days? Nah, screw that scene. I wasn't going anywhere with him. I decided I'd go hang out for a couple days, stay away from the home until after they needed to leave. Nick Foley's precious plans would be ruined. Sure, it would be awkward for a while, but I didn't have any better ideas. Things would go back to normal eventually, I told myself. Even as I cut through Sector 7 towards the warehouses in Sector 8, they were the go-to spot for teenage runaways to lie low. I was just about there when Sector 7 fell. Several pillars bore the incredible weight of the colossal elevated disc. But when terrorists blew up the Sector 7 support, the entire section tore away from the neighboring sectors 6 and 8 and crashed to the ground. The collapse annihilated the slums below and killed a huge number of people. When the bomb went off, I was right on the border between 7 and 8. As the ground started shuddering under me, I booked it to Sector 8. I didn't know what was happening behind me. I just joined the flood of people running for dear life. It took a while before I learned about Sector 7's collapse. Sector 6 was intact according to the reports, but nobody really knew anything for sure. I was worried about my mom. I tried to go home through the Sector 0, the city's center, but Shinra troops had the place on lockdown to prevent any more terrorist attacks. I had no choice but to take the long way around, from Sector 8 through 1, 2, 3. Everyone was terrified, wondering what was going to get blown up next. The same terrorist psychos had bombed the Sector 1 Mako reactor just a few days earlier. It took me 3 days to get all the way around Midgar and back home. Normally, I could have done it in maybe a day, walking non-stop without rest or sleep. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I ended up taking a 3-day tour of the city. Things went wrong from the get-go. I got lost in Sector 8's unfamiliar streets, panicked and started running away until the sweat soaked my thin clothes. Now night was coming in, and a cold wind whipped among the warehouses. I started to get a bad stomachache, then fever and chills. I cursed my weak constitution as I tried to find shelter. Finally, I stumbled across an empty warehouse and collapsed on what I assumed was an abandoned mattress. That was when an unsavory-looking bunch showed up. They were around the same age as me, but if I was a house cat, this was a gang of ferals. They demanded payment for the space. "That's how it works around here, pal," they snarled, but I didn't have a gill on me or anything to barter with. So I ended up serving as a punching bag for their frustrations instead. My back and gut were screaming by the time they were finished kicking me. I slept through the night at least, but I wasn't any less sick in the morning. Still, I didn't want to pony up for the room and board again. I had to make sure my mom was okay. But mostly, I just wanted to go home. I mustered all my willpower and left the den. The next couple of days were a blur. I staggered on, resting every 5 minutes, it felt like, until finally I made it home, sometime in the afternoon of day 3. Our house was just the same as when I'd left. My mom wasn't home, but she would be at work this time of day anyway. I took some cold medicine, burrowed into my bed, and fell asleep, figuring I'd pay her a visit after I woke up. It was dark out by the time I was conscious again, and I felt a little better, strong enough to get to the bar where she worked. First, though, I need to take a shower. I toweled off on the way back to my room, then put on some underwear, black pants, and a dark blue sweater to give me a little extra bulk. It was the most grown-up looking outfit I could throw together. My build hadn't caught up with my height yet, and a rangy kid like me was bound to get laughed at right out of the bar. "Mama's boy is here, somebody get him a glass of warm milk and tuck him in." I was about to go out, but I couldn't just leave my bed a mess. Force of habit, I guess. I tucked in the thin sheets and straightened out my pillow. I noticed an envelope under it. Inside, I found a wad of cash and a letter from my mom. "Leaving with Nick as planned. I'll call to let you know where we are when things calm down. Half the money is for food, save the rest for traveling to our new home. All business." Sector 7 had fallen the same day I ran away. She must have known what had happened and how bad the danger was by the time she wrote this. But she'd taken off with that douchebag before she was sure her son was safe. And she even seemed to think I'd chase them down myself if she said they were going. It made no sense to me. I went into my mom's room and opened up the closet. The hangers were still full of her day job outfits, and she figured made her look younger, and the embarrassingly tasteless getups she wore for her night gig. So apparently, she was done with working, but she'd taken all her regular clothes from the closet floor. I sat on the bed staring into space for a while, until I remembered that hidey hole in the ceiling. I brought a chair from the kitchen and plunked it in the middle of the room so I could reach. I climbed on, poked one of the boards out of place, and tossed it onto the bed, then peered into the rectangular gap. This was where my mom stashed her treasure box of money and keepsakes. The money was whatever she could scrape together from her paychecks every week, and the keepsakes were mementos of my firsts. My umbilical cord, a lock from my first haircut, my first baby tooth to come out, all pretty gross in my opinion, but my mom seemed to think they were priceless or something. I reached through the gap, and my fingertips just brushed the box and pushed it out of reach. I grabbed the sides of the hole and hauled myself up to see where it was, but then the stupid ceiling board gave way. The chair went from under me, and I damn near fell headlong onto the floor, but I somehow managed to land on my feet. I guess I was on a lucky run, because when I broke the board off, the box came down out of the ceiling along with 2 paper bags. The treasure box was really just a wooden crate for a cheese wheel. The lid was decorated with purple crayon likeness and dumb apple, my favorite fruit, courtesy of my younger self. I opened it up, and all the treasures were inside, including Mom's savings. So the money she'd left under my pillow wasn't from the box. Where did she get it? From Nick Douchebag Foley's wallet? I hadn't seen these bags before, though. I picked one up and pulled the brand new white paper apart to look inside. When I saw what was there, you could have knocked me down with a chocobo feather. There was enough money there to make my head spin. Enough to live in comfort for a whole year at least. The bills were just as crisp as the bag, still bound in currency bands. The band was loose around one of the stacks, and putting two and two together, I figured this was where the money under my pillow came from. I felt like I'd found one piece of the puzzle, except the puzzle was turning out to be bigger than I'd ever imagined. Like, where the heck did my mom get this much money? I could only think of one answer to that. Nick loaded fully. The other bag was made of a heavy pale green paper. I peeled off the tape sealing it and found a dark brown leather satchel with a flap and metal fasteners. It was rugged enough to be military issue, or maybe equipment for an adventurer. When I opened the flap, I saw a small card inside. Happy 17th birthday. When you grow up brave and strong, I think this bag will suit you. Love, Mom. Love, Mom, who got you a birthday present, hid it in the ceiling, then skipped town before it was time to give it to you. Love, Mom, who ran to hell knows where with a grinning slime ball with deep pockets, leaving behind a mountain of cash and a son. How was all this connected? Where did the pieces come together? I sat on her bed and mulled it over, but I got the feeling thinking wouldn't help me find the right answers. She'd call me eventually. There was nothing to do but wait for the phone to ring, so I decided to fix the ceiling. I took the board and stood on the chair to put it back. It gave me some trouble, and my arm started turning to jelly. I got so worked up that in the end, no matter how determined I was not to think about it, I had to face the infuriating fact. My mother wasn't that tall. Even standing on a chair, she couldn't reach the ceiling. Keeping a stash up there was my idea. After I'd grown taller than her, ever since putting things into the treasure box has been my job. I knew her take-home pay and our household savings. I knew exactly how poor we were. So, the million-gill question. Who put the cash and the birthday present in the ceiling without me knowing? The tall man who looked down his nose at me from the front door to my own house? That's who? Nick lying-ass Foley has been in my mom's room when I was out? I left the busted ceiling and marched over to our phone on the wall by the front door, and I yanked out the cable. I wanted them to know just how mad I was. I tried to get back to something resembling a normal life. I went to tutoring, hung out with friends, watched TV, considered burning through the stacks of cash, but I didn't like the fact that Nick Foley was paying for my fun. More to the point, I honestly couldn't think of a good way to spend it. I ended up stashing it in my birthday satchel and mostly forgetting about it. I had a lot of trouble sleeping at night, so one evening, I found I might as well crack open a book. My mom's one hobby was reading, so her room was stocked with plenty of novels. I selected Volume 1 of Escape from Wutai, because it was the end of the shelf and caught my eye first. No other reason. The book was old, written back during the war, and it opened with a lengthy account of the Wutaians employing their extraordinary martial arts powers to kill prisoners in a POW camp. Finally, when the Wutaians weren't looking, 5 of the prisoners managed to escape. 3 men and 2 women. There's a 5th wheel, I thought. One of the men isn't gonna make it. Probably the asshole officer from the Shinra military. But in an unexpected twist, the officer lived to take over as leader and boss the other 4 around. I started actively hoping he'd get the axe soon. Near the end of the volume, my prayers were answered. But the how made me sit up and take serious notice. The officer stepped on a landmine in Wutai and died on the spot. Now, here's why I sat up. See, my mom told me exactly one thing about my father. He stepped on a landmine in Wutai and was killed instantly. Had she pulled the story from this book? Did she project this asshole onto him? Did she think he deserved to die too? Probably. She must have really hated him. I was impressed she could bring herself to raise the son of a man like that. Or maybe it only made it easier for her to leave me behind once she had a choice. I believe my mother loved me, but what if she hated me too? What if there were just 2 sides of the same coin? I hurled Volume 1 of Escape from Wutai against the wall. It's not like I cared enough about the other 4 characters to read the rest. I went back to my mom's room and gave her collection a closer look. The shelves were packed with adventure stories. That much was clear from the titles. The covers featured illustrations of the main character, always a woman, although not always the same type. My mom loved books like this, about places she could never see and adventures she could never have, and probably romance to make her heart flutter, although I didn't want to dwell on it that much. She must have been so bored, so frustrated in this tiny house with me. Whatever, she ditched me. I wouldn't think about her anymore. I had to figure out how to live on my own. The next day, I stopped in at the cafe where she'd worked in the daytime. The manager's square face and broad shoulders called to mind an old-fashioned robot, and I had to listen to his long-winded rant about my mom suddenly quitting. I wasn't unprepared for that, but it hit me harder than I thought. After a while of griping, he seemed to remember I was there and asked what he could do for me. I told him I was looking for work. Given the laundry list of complaints against my family, I figured he would turn me down, but he immediately made a call to the owner. I couldn't fathom why he'd do such a thing. But then again, I'd been completely oblivious to my own mother's feelings. My inability to understand other people shouldn't come as a surprise. And just like that, I had a job, helping out on the delivery truck that stocked all the owner's establishments. I turned up just the right time. My predecessor had been more than happy to quit just hours earlier for a position with the Shinra company. Suddenly, my days were full. There was something rewarding about manual labor, and I enjoyed the complete change of scenery that came with the new job. Not a day went by that I didn't think of my mom, of course. But for 4 to 6 hours at a stretch, I could keep my mind occupied otherwise. 10 days after I'd ripped out the phone, I plugged it back in. Maybe she tried to call in the meantime, or maybe it rang when I wasn't home. But a phone call wasn't the only means of contacting someone. And the continuing silence convinced me I'd been abandoned. But that was okay. I really do hope you're happy, Mom. I'm enjoying life here in my own way. It wasn't a cushy job, driving a delivery truck, but it gave me the distinct pleasure of being needed. That was new to me, and despite the hard labor, I wasn't scared about my heart at all. I was starting to believe I could do more than I thought. So, Mom, what do you think of that? I was just beginning to think this could be my life forever when another upheaval horned in out of nowhere. I was watching TV when they interrupted the show with footage of a huge rock in the sky above Midgar. They didn't know if it was a comet or an asteroid or what. But the sudden arrival of a pitch-black maw in the sky flouted all laws of astronomy. They ended up calling it meteor. And in 7 days, it was going to smash into our planet. Or so people were saying. Then, giant monsters appeared. One in the north and another off the coast of Jinan. Even the Shinra company and its massive arsenal couldn't take them down. The city was full of crazy rumors. Like, you'll be safe if you hide in a Mako reactor. The company has built an underground shelter in Calm. The only thing we knew for sure, though, was that Meteor was getting closer, day by day. And as it did, all the arguments about what it really was and how to stop it kind of just died down. My boss closed all his shops and left Midgar. The neighborhood was in an uproar with people preparing to evacuate. Buddies and acquaintances from work were urging me to hitch a ride with them out of town. But I said no thanks. Looking up at Meteor, I felt the weight of my mortality for the first time. All I could think of was when my mom and how we'd parted on such bad terms. If I left home now, I'd break my last remaining connection to her. I spent hours staring at pictures of us together, few as they were. All of them were studio photos from my birthdays, showing me gradually getting bigger next to her. My expression turned to a scowl around the time my height overtook hers, but she was always smiling. Looking at her smile, I realized how stupid I'd been. My mother wouldn't abandon me. All the things I should have done rushed into my head, like asking Shinra where Nick Foley was, or plugging the phone in again right away and setting up an answering machine. And I arrived at answers to questions I'd refused to think about, like what the pile of money in the ceiling meant. Never mind how she got it, if she left it hidden in the ceiling. It was because she planned to come back. Or maybe for me to bring it to her. Probably the latter. It wasn't her idea for us to be apart for so long. And there was the present, too. She always made a big deal out of birthdays. She would have made sure I found it on the right day, either by mentioning it in her letter or having it somewhere easier to find. But she hadn't, because she really did plan to call me right away. I should have just waited for the phone to ring. Damn, I was such an idiot. And then came the unforgettable day. Torrents of energy, the life stream, I learned later, burst from the earth to stop the falling meteor. I survived. For a full week, I waited at home for my mom. On the night of the 7th day, I wandered out of the house and down from the plate to the slums. The story I'm about to tell you begins 2 years after that. I'll probably mention some of the events that happened in the meantime, but I hope I can keep it relatively straightforward without too many tangents. And you might have noticed, though, making the right decision isn't really my forte. Bear with me, alright? Oh, and one more thing. From time to time, I also might touch on things I don't actually know, so I'll take a few artistic liberties. Like this next bit, for example. 2. How it all began. By the time Elena joined the company, the Cliffside Resort had already been abandoned some time ago. It was an odd location for a resort. The terrain was too rough, like some giant had tossed together a pile of enormous boulders. Several lodges were built to conform to an uneven landscape. And some people might have found them visually interesting, but once you took a few pictures and the novelty wore off, the place had nothing else left to offer. Nobody would come out here a second time. Of all the R&R facilities established by the Shinra company, this one was unanimously considered the worst. Now what? The Shinra Empire had ruled most of the world up until 2 short years ago, and it didn't sit right with Elena that the company president had to live in such a desolate place. Yes, medical treatment was available, security was better away from the city, and the commute was only 2 hours by car. The staff could have had it much worse, of course. So, sure, there were plenty of reasons to use this location, but none of them made it any less depressing. At the president's behest, the resort was renamed Helan. Of course, only the name changed, nothing else. Elena groaned in frustration. Nothing ever happened here. There were benches in the courtyard where the geostigma patients would sit and chat, and some of them would volunteer to help despite their painful symptoms. Yesterday was no different, and neither would tomorrow. Even the weather stayed the same. Elena seems bored, Rufus Shinra said as he stepped away from the lodge window and turned to his chief operative, Sang. I think it's about time we commence the next project. He left it at that and struggled back to his wheelchair. Yes, sir, Sang replied. I'll let her know shortly, but I might keep it from Reno and Rude for the time being. The excitement of a new project could distract them from their duties in the city. Your decision. Have you gathered enough intel on Genova? Not yet, sir. Genova was a freakish entity that came from outer space many years ago. No one knows what state it was in now. Perhaps it was only shriveled scraps of flesh, perhaps some other monstrous form. It was hard to tell whether it even qualified as a living being, but if it was anywhere nearby, Sang was certain they would find it. One question, Mr. President. Once we have recovered Genova, what do you mean to do with it? My father, Rufus began with a distant look. When he witnessed the flow of the life stream through the planet, he dubbed it Mako energy and commodified it. The new energy revolutionized every facet of contemporary industry, bringing unprecedented prosperity to the world. Yes, sir. His company amassed incredible wealth and power, and while he made sure to line his own pockets well, he poured much of the profits onto R&D. Any and all fields were fair game, including Genova. Ultimately, these experiments yielded the entity known as Sephiroth. Sephiroth was a fiend, a human Genova hybrid with power beyond comprehension. His exploits on the battlefield earned him recognition as a hero and a legend. But for all his physical strength, he could not bear the weight of what he was. When he discovered his own origins as the child of Genova, his mind shattered. He didn't just turn on the company, he turned on the entire planet. During the battle to stop Sephiroth, the Shinra company was destroyed, while the planet itself narrowly staved off its own annihilation. The old man's bowed out, and we're the ones who have to deal with his legacy, said Rufus. But who said life was fair, Sang? Sang looked at him without comment. I do things differently, Rufus's voice rose, and he wheeled himself to the window where he could see the victims of geostigma in the courtyard below. I'll put an end to the nightmare he bequeathed on us, once and for all. Elena stood behind the lodge, where the grounds met the forest. A moss-scented breeze ruffled her short blonde hair. I wish something would happen. She was wise enough to know that was a reckless thing to wish for. But still, she meant it. She turned slightly, making sure no one had overheard, and stepped onto the broad, winding path among the trees. Soon, she could see the old rec hall. It was the largest building in the complex, even though it was just a log cabin that could only hold 30 at most. Elena covered the last few yards with a nimble leap and landed in front of the door, which she securely locked from the inside. She pressed the buzzer to the right of it, and it was a good 10 seconds before she heard Throp's drawl inside. That you, Miss Elena? Elena's senior colleagues, Reno and Rude, had picked up the young man in the city somewhere. Security check, open up, she ordered, without bothering to hide her irritation. After another moment, the door opened. All good in here, ma'am, Throp said, lazily scratching his unkempt hair. His mop was too long to be called short, and too short to be called long. He towered over Elena. His posture was slack and careless. His belly formed a balloon under his shirt. He was completely unsuited to guarding anything. But they were understaffed. If you wanted to know how bad the Shinra company was doing these days, you just had to look at this sad sack. Elena edged around the massive frame and into the cabin, giving the place a well-trained once-over. Left to right, right to left, and left again. Yep, all good. Until last week, they'd been using this building as a pharmaceutical lab, developing a drug to relieve the full-body pain that racked the sufferers of the stigma. The stimulant that the company had once issued to members of Soldier was already known to help alleviate the symptoms, so the research team had analyzed it and developed a formula that reproduced the effects. They had run fast-track trials on volunteer patients, and now at last had a drug that worked and could be mass-produced. The formula would be provided free of charge to organizations that could handle the manufacturing, starting with the WRO. This was Elena's project, from the initial proposal all the way to the running around necessary to bring it to fruition. She'd recruited the staff from the remnants of Shinra scientific research and chemical engineering departments. Many of the old Shinra scientists had been morally bankrupt as they were intellectually gifted, and Elena didn't trust the eggheads enough to leave them unattended. She kept a hawkish eye on them at all times, just in case they decided there was a money to be made in the side projects such as dangerous narcotics. Her fears, however, turned out to be unfounded. The researchers at Helan were good, passionately dedicated people, and worked around the clock to perfect the drug in a surprisingly short time. Elena chided herself for questioning them, and when the work was done, she thanked each one of them personally. Most of the assorted chemical and medical equipment had been packed in boxes and stacked against the wall near the entrance to the rec hall. The equipment would be donated to doctors and researchers continuing the fight against geostigma in Edge and other cities. 2 sturdy metal cases sat on the shelves in the back. One contained samples of the drug for the patients here, strictly controlled with a distribution log due to their limited supply. The other one contained the reports, formulas, and manufacturing instructions to be delivered to the WRO. Oh, I checked it, ma'am. It's all in order, Throp said as Elena approached the shelves. Just following procedure. Gotcha. Behind her, Throp sounded less than happy. Elena picked up the log and opened the case. The distribution and records were the purview of her boss, Sang, and the log contained line after line of his methodical handwriting. She compared the number in the remaining supply column against the contents of the case. Check. Then she examined the small hygrometer placed inside, as the drug was vulnerable to fluctuations in humidity. It wouldn't turn toxic or entirely useless, but trials had confirmed that it could lose some potency. They should do something about that eventually. But for the moment, the top priority was taking care of the current stocks. Good, you're behaving today. Check. She looked at the other case, exactly like the first to all appearances, so it was sealed with a sticker to differentiate it. Just check this one, and the sticker had been pulled back. Throp, were you handling this? No, why would I? He retorted promptly. Elena took the cell phone from the holster at her hip and called her boss. Sang, sir? Did you remove that sticker on the case? The one we're sending out? As she listened to her phone, she tracked Throp in her peripheral vision. He was gazing out the window with a reproachful sort of look. Why there? Elena deliberately turned away from him. That must be it. Yes, I will, sir, she replied to her boss. Meanwhile, she could sense Throp creeping toward the exit, trying to put one over on her, on the company. Stop or I'll shoot. The warning was low and even, and Throp froze with hunched shoulders. Have a seat, Elena gestured, with her chin to the folding chair. Throp obeyed, though in no particular hurry. She took the packing twine from the shelf and bound the large man's hands and feet. Now sit tight. Outside, Elena took off, not back toward the complex, but to the border between the brush and the woods, the direction Throp had just been gazing at through the window of the rec hall. She sprinted like a hound on the scent, leaping over the tree roots that threatened to trip her. Her heart raced with the conviction that she would catch Throp's accomplice, maybe even the ringleader if she was fast enough. Yes, this was a job for a Turk. While developing a drug was an experience she wouldn't soon forget, it wasn't her real work. Sure, she'd taken pride in doing something for the public good, but at their core, the Turks served the Shinra company out in the field. Defending its interests was their number one mission. The trees were starting to thin as she spotted her prey, a stout man stumbling toward the open ground beyond the forest. Stop right there, she called. Startled, the fugitive came to a halt and turned around. He was fairly young, locks of dark curly hair plastered to his forehead and dripping with sweat. The black rectangular frames of his glasses were slipping down his face. He wore a green sweater and dark green pants, as if he'd thought that it might help him camouflage himself in the woods. But they stood out like a traffic signal against the gray-brown branches. The man made for such a pathetic sight that Elena nearly wilted in disappointment. Just let me go, he cried, his round face flushing red, and he took off again. Not too bright, are you? Energized once more, Elena chased him. She wanted to catch him before he got out of the forest. Maybe he had a getaway vehicle waiting. There was no way he hiked all the way out here. She was closing in on him when her phone rang. It was Sang. She had the answer. Yes, sir, I'll be right there. Elena hung up and watched the man in green get further away, running at such a tilt that he looked in constant danger of falling on his face. Then she sighed heavily and turned back to the complex. Now, Sang said, to the heap by his feet and crouched down. Throp was on the floor, chair and all, avoiding his eyes. Blood from his broken nose stained the floor. Where can we find this Fabio Braun?